sex, is it overrated? So probably more questions than answers out of my presentation. Sex and gender. What's changed and why perhaps it's going to influence what actuaries do. And as an example, looking at rating on sex and looking at Australian mortality. And a little bit, it interrelates with fairness. So there's a bit on fairness towards the end. What triggered all this was some big changes, particularly in Australia, where you can change your sex on your birth certificate now in some states, and you can change it annually, and with very little fuss. And for example, in Victoria, the choices are male, female, and a descriptor of up to 100 words. So that makes life for actuaries particularly tricky. In the ACT, they gave you 3 choices, but again, 3 choices. So quite a big change. There was another big change which I've just been tracking over the years, and that's the convergence of mortality rates between males and females. It's quite significant. We don't have the latest government actuaries for Australia mortality tables yet, but I presume they will show something, perhaps with COVID, a little bit put off by the COVID experience, but nevertheless, the mortality rates are converging. And then we had the controversy over the athletics and swimming, redefining what a female athlete is in terms of their what they called the natural testosterone level, which was deemed to be too high compared to a normal female, what they call a normal female. And I thought, in my own mind, well, that's interesting, because on the left-hand side there, I've got a graph. The little shaded area is the normal height of females in the US. And the big block of pink there is the women who play basketball. Right, so if you said, oh, well, we're going to discriminate against, or not discriminate, sorry, we're not going to let tall females play basketball, you would lose all your very good basketballers. So it's an interesting concept that testosterone defines what is female. And the lady on the left there, she was the one the athletics were targeting. They said that she, firstly they thought she was male, then they decided no, she's not. She was actually female at birth, female identity. And they went to testosterone. They restricted it to the events she competed in and said, well, if you've got higher than normal testosterone, you can't compete. And they didn't do it for the athlete on the right-hand side. Apparently she was okay because she sprints, she does 100 metres. And she may or may not have high testosterone. But the point about the athletes is they've all got beautiful athletic bodies. So it's very hard. And I only raise this as an issue of, well, what does it mean to be male and female? What is this spectrum that seems to be coming around? So very quickly, sex is based on it's a biological thing, and gender is a social thing. So sex determined by the characteristics, typically things like chromosomes, genitals, and those things typically line up. There's 4 of them I've listed there. Hormones, chromosomes, reproductive organs, genitals. They typically line up, but they don't always line up. So some people aren't XX or XY, they can be XXY. So we get this variation, and what we find is we're not coming out of a 3D printer. We're actually got quite a bit of variety coming through, and that estimates about 2% of people are what's called intersex, or DSD, which is the difference in sex development. So they may have 3 out of those 4, 2 out of those 4. There's a variety. Gender, on the other hand, is the social, cultural differences. Typically, people identify as male or female, or they don't identify as either. And of course, both those things can change over your lifetime. So It's a reasonably fluid thing. I think a lot of this talk is about variation. So here's the variation in testosterone levels amongst males. So when we say males have high testosterone levels than females, what we mean is the average male has a lot more testosterone than the average female. But within the male population, this is 11,000 males. In some study, sorry, I haven't actually identified it in this, but I will. And just shows the variety of results in the humans. This is by age. And you can see the distribution around the mean there. Okay, and then we have terms like cisgender, where your gender and your sex align, and then you have fluidity, where they don't align. Now, I look at mortality when I was thinking about this in terms of the part that is biological and the part that is, if you like, social or environmental. Because I think fundamentally, what is the mortality we should be looking at as actuaries? It's the actual thing you can't change as a human being, the thing you can't influence, which is particularly your chromosomes and what they do in terms of producing sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. The theory on why the biology is better for females is they have two X's. The X chromosome is a very useful chromosome, and it does things like brain development, immunity, a few other things. The Y chromosome is only there for reproduction. Very small, and of not much use other than that. So if you have a damaged X and you're a female, the other X will come into play. And not only that, apparently, the theory goes, the body chooses the better X. So if you're making a heart, you have of course, the X, you get an X from your mum, an X from your dad. The better X will develop that organ for you. This is the theory. So females have a natural advantage there. Doesn't mean that all males have a disadvantage, because they might have a very good X. Okay. Estrogen is associated with higher levels of immunity. Testosterone is associated with higher levels of risk-taking. I've got to be careful what I say. The other part is the environment. And I want to delve into the environment a little bit. But you'll see I've said this is a simplistic way of looking at it, and it is really, but it's a nice way to look at it. So that's the way I've cut it. If you want to see how complex it is, you can go and, there's a little reference there, and you can go and see how there's all these feedback loops into the parts that make you male or female for the purpose of gender, and male or female for the purpose of sex. So I've just put that slide in. And here we have the historical mortality rates for Australia, broken down by age and sex, like an old actuary. And age 5, age 60, they're converging. And they're converging quite rapidly, but they're not together. And arguably they might not come together, and maybe that's the biology part. And that's the graph since 1970. It's mainly the picture you need to see there. And it's pretty well the same at every age group. Until you reach 100, and then they're equal. So for all of us who are going to make it to 100, there you go. You'll be equal. If we look at the ratio of female to male mortality by age, and I've done this across Japan, Australia, and the US and the UK, just because I could. And I've standardised it around the 2015 period. And you can see that at the younger ages, the ratio is approaching 1. Right? This is when there's very little environmental, cultural difference between males and females, at least in Australia. And so maybe there's a little bit of XY going in there, that's the theory. But of course, as soon as you get to 16, 17, 18, then in theory anyway, the testosterone's kicking in, the males are taking more risk, and we get this enormous fall in the ratio. And then it slowly increases. Japan's a bit of an outlier, and we'll have a look at why that is. As I said before, there's quite a bit of variation in outcomes. So all these things we're looking at here are averages. This is the graph of the distribution of expected lifespan for a 65-year-old in Australia between males and females. And they're not that much different. And really, there's a lot of overlap. So when we hear people say males or females live longer than males, that's not quite the truth. The truth of these numbers is the average female lived longer than the average male, because mortality is an outcome of past habits, environments, etc., as well as the fundamental part of the difference in mortality. So I think that variation is very important. If you look hard at that there isn't, you can see a large proportion. I haven't tried to estimate it, but this is from the Australian Government Actuary. What proportion of males actually will outlive the average female, for example? Things like that. Okay, looking at the environment, I thought it's interesting to see what effect does the environment have, and I just pulled out two examples. So one is smoking, and the other is motor accidents. They're fairly obvious ones. I'm sure there's a lot more. So this is the graph we had previously of the mortality difference. You can see that Australia, the UK and the US, the grey, the yellow and the sort of browny colour, all have similar patterns, but Japan, the ratio falls rather dramatically, back down to 40%. And when you line that up with the smoking habits of Japanese men, you can see why. So the graph on the right here is the difference by country between the smoking rates of males and females. And in Japan, culturally, men smoke. Maybe there are people here from Japan who can explain why that is. Men smoke and women don't, culturally don't. Whereas in the US and Australia and UK, they're pretty similar and they're quite low, but they're falling. That gap is falling. So clearly there is a link without doing all the maths behind it. I don't have to do the maths here, I don't think. There is some sort of link between smoking, for example, which I call cultural or environmental, and mortality rates. Here we have the accident hump disappearing. On the left there for males. A little bit on the right, there was an accident hump for a while for females, but it's disappeared as well. And a lot of that accident hump is just the motor vehicle accidents, because young males killed themselves in motor vehicles. They drove older cars, they drove them poorly, they were inexperienced drivers, and they took risk. Now that's the graph on the left is the white line is the rate per 100,000 of population. Mostly males being saved by improving the road safety. And next to that's the 20-year-old convergence of male and female mortality. Lines up very well. So a lot of things here, just because the average male had a higher risk of death on the road doesn't mean all males were bad drivers. A lot of us survived our 20s. So a lot of us have never had an accident, right? So okay, so I think the environmental differences in Australia anyway are starting to diminish or disappear, and I've put some examples up there. And if you look at dangerous occupations, they're becoming less dangerous. They're dominated by men. But women are participating in those, not at great rates, but they're participating more than they did in the past. Motor vehicle accidents and deaths are reducing. Smoking has become a similar, is running at similar levels. Testosterone levels worldwide are falling. There's good research on that. Keep going. Yep. And I'd argue females are taking more risk. They're enjoying taking risk. So some of them want to play heavy contact sport, for example. Quite a few of them want it. In fact, amongst my mates, we all played heavy contact sport. More of their daughters are now playing heavy contact sport than their sons. So it's an interesting change happening. There's another interesting one, which is the obesity impacts women more than it impacts men at the substantially increased risk of metabolic, so heart attack and that sort of stuff, metabolic complications. So women, 46 men. These are just factors lining up the mortality rates, I think, or explaining why there's some convergence. Let's get on to fairness and risk factors. So a risk factor is a factor that influences the incidence or the consequence of a risk. A rating factor is something we use for pricing. The risk factor has a strong causal relationship, or should be the cause, a cause. A rating factor is more of a convenience, and it'll have a correlation. Rating factors are used quite well, mostly, to keep the sustainability of life companies, general insurers, etc. Keep the institution alive, stop it falling over, allowing it to protect its portfolio and protect its profitability. But when we look at fairness, there are actually two different things here for rating factors. The insurer looks for something that is verifiable, available, correlated to risk, unable to be changed. That's not what the consumer's looking for, I don't think. They're looking for something that's fair, reflecting their risk. So more how far you drive your car or how you drive your car, not who is it that's driving the car. It's a good example. The insured is looking for a price signal too, I think. If you change your behaviour, you'll get a better premium or better benefits. And they're looking for convenience. So just looking at mortality, it struck me that it was, when I grew up, there was just male and female, and it was a great rating factor. And we cut everything by age and sex. But now, maybe not so good. It's no longer binary, no longer clearly defined. It can be changed frequently. It correlates with claim rates, but I think it overstates the difference because it's not taking into account the environmental part of it. So and in that sense, it lacks some fairness. It's unclear that the past is a good indicator of the future. So we use mortality rates based on the past and the past environments that have influenced those mortality rates. And there's clumping, I understand. So insurers will clump. They might have male-female rates, but all those male-female rates they can't afford to be too far out from the other insurers. So you get clumping, which is also unfair. Okay. I think in the Australian Sex Discrimination Act, it's reasonably weak. You can pretty well do what you want, cut the data how you want, rate how you want. The test is correlation, not cause. Now, I think it lacks a fairness test. There should be some override to that. And it produces inconsistent outcomes for insured lives. And all you've got to do is look at the superannuation funds that rate on sex, and you'll see how inconsistent the treatment is. The other thing we know is unisex is viable. It's been done in Europe now for 10 years or more. And it's a good default position to have. It's used in the Australian pension system, it's used in the Australian health system, private and public, and most Australian superannuation funds, retirement funds. So I think the conclusion for me was, where we still want to discriminate, is it possible to break up the biological from the environmental to try and create a bit of a fairer rating factor? If it is significant, then how significant is it? Is it worth bothering, converging mortality rates? If it is significant, would this form the basis of a fairer premium? And what are we going to do with disability cover? But probably the better solution is to remove it as a rating factor, at least over time. It may have had its day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And I'll now put some of the questions that have already come through. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. First question is, how do you differentiate the biological factors versus environmental factors of gender for mortality risk? Given the emerging mortality rates gap between them, how do you determine if there's still a real biological difference underlying mortality?
How do you determine that? Well, I had intended to do a paper for this session, but there's so much research out there on this. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to look at that question. How do you break up, or what is the influence of that second X for females? And, you know, maybe there is already that research out there. But I think that's the big question that I left there at the end. How significant is it? And I've got a question back. I don't know the answer.
Okay. And another question. What was the experience in the EU when they changed to unisex rating factors? Did insurance premiums increase for everyone?
That's really interesting. There's a paradox in the EU which you can read about. It involves the general insurance, motor vehicle insurance. So they removed the distinct, they would rate males higher than females because males are, take a risk. Males have crashes at higher rates, so of course the actuarial textbook came out and rates were going to go up. Females were going to be ripped off. Males are going to get a good deal. But what the actuaries, presumably, did, they found other rating factors. And they rated on things like occupation, which is also heavily correlated to use. So what they found was the worst accident rate was amongst tradies. And part of that's because they're always on the road. Right, so tradies got loaded. People who'd modified their cars got loaded. People with fast cars got loaded. People with expensive cars. So they all correlated to male. But it's not that they correlated. It's not that they correlated to male so much. It's that males correlated to them. I mean, I think it's the other way around. So a lot of males don't drive, you know, hotted up cars with aviation fuel instead of petrol. So, like some of my friends. So, and then what they found in the EU was the males actually, as a group, ended up paying more in premium than they used to, and the females ended up paying less. The females were actually being diddled, if you like, as a group, by the old male-female cut of the data. And it's a lazy rating factor.
Look, here's a question I don't fully understand, so maybe you do, and I'll ask the questioner. The question is there an increasing trend in DSD proportion, whether just measured or actual? And I wasn't sure what DSD...
That's the differences in sex development.
Oh.
So that was that intersex. So the four criteria, if you like, for being male or female for sex purposes, you know, chromosomes and genitals, etc. If they don't line up, is there an increasing
trend in DSD proportion?
I don't know, because I think a lot of this research is more recent. And I don't know that we'd know what the trend was. Why would there be an increasing trend? No, I can't think why there would be an increasing trend.
Another question, ignoring sex, should we use environmental factors such as income and education as rating factors? Is that fair? That's a pretty wide question, isn't it?
That's for the actuaries who have to work out the rates. I mean, my view is you wouldn't use. I wouldn't rate on sex. Would I rate on income? No. I think partly that's self-selected because people with higher incomes, for example, with death cover, will have higher sums insured, so they'll be buying more of the product. They'll self-rate. I think, yeah.
And another question, if I remove gender, sex from my rating algorithm, the premiums are different in practice for the average gender. Do you think this is a fairer outcome?
It's the default outcome. Under the legislation, to not discriminate is the default. So what we have to prove as actuaries is to go outside that we have some sort of science behind what we're doing, and that what we're doing, I think, is fair. And if we can't do that, we should fall back on the default and walk away from the rating factor.
Okay, and I think last question here, I think is a very good one. I will reveal it's from a female who was asked this question. If sex is overrated, why does everything I register for ask me for my sex gender?
Just don't answer. It's interesting, isn't it? Because we had a look at what superannuation funds, the retirement funds in Australia do, and just to join the fund, you actually, in a lot of the funds, you have to identify yourself as male or female. In some of them, they can legitimately do that because they have default cover that is sex-based, but that's very few of them. So all the other ones are asking you for male, female. Some of them allow you to put in a not specified, but very few. And I think they want your gender or your sex because they want to market to you differently. So it's information you shouldn't have to give them, but if you want to join that fund, you have to drop that data in. So I think there's a lot of data being collected on people by various institutions that probably they're not entitled to.
Okay, well look, thanks very much,
okay,
Jeff. As you know, there'll be further questions later on. So we just thank Jeff again.